Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 183, The Dream Factory, a conversation with Daniel Swift. Today's episode is the first in a short run of guest episodes to see us through the end of the English summer. And first up, it is Daniel Swift, author of The Dream Factory, London's First Playhouse and the Making of William Shakespeare. Given that title, I don't think Daniel's book needs any further introduction, other than to say that I found it an absolutely fascinating read, and I hope this episode gives you just a taster of Daniel's work and the research that he has undertaken. Daniel Swift is Associate Professor of English at Northeastern University, London, and has written books on Shakespeare, Ezra Pound, and the poetry of the Second World War, and articles for The New York Times, The New Statesman and The Spectator. I spoke to Daniel over a Zoom call from London. The basis for the tale that you extrapolate in the book is the various and many records of the legal disputes between the Burbages and various other parties. So perhaps a great place to start would be if you could give us a word about where those records are and really what it's like to feel and read those documents. Must be amazing.
It certainly is amazing. Yes, and thank you. And thank you for having me on the show. What I've found is that the real excitement in research is the moment when you discover something, not only that's new to you or you hope to other people, but that you actually feel in some way like you are, it sounds a bit mystical, but kind of in touch with history. And the legal records that I spent a long time dealing with, look on the surface like the driest possible documents that you can imagine. So the great majority of the records that I was working on are these legal documents produced around a series of cases that kind of engulfed the playhouse called the theatre during the 1570s and 1580s on into the 1590s. And the majority of those are now in the National Archives, and some are in the London Archives, what used to be called the London Metropolitan Archives. And they're unwieldy documents to deal with, firstly because they are mainly on kind of parchment rolls, and then you have to deal with the terrible handwriting. Luckily, what helped me a great deal is that many of these records, not all of them, but many were transcribed in the years just before the First World War, mostly by a great kind of antiquarian scholar called William Wallace, who was an absolute kind of mountain of amongst scholarly figures of this period. And he transcribed, he always claimed a million words of documents. So he transcribed an enormous number of the key documents. The first level of their, I suppose, unwieldiness is a physical one. It's actually dealing with these documents themselves, actually figuring out how to read them. But then even once you've transcribed them or read them, you're faced with documents that, again, look on first reading like they are repetitive, often very mundane, very, very legalistic. And what you have to do, what I found, is you have to spend enough time with them to start looking for coincidences, to start looking for patterns. Right. And the magic for a scholar is the moment where you find somebody speaking in 1577, in 1582, and you can catch their words now. And that's an extraordinary sort of moment that takes place. And the useful thing for legal documents, at least for my purposes, is that they are these great kind of vats of amber in which have been preserved these traces of long ago lives. And many other scholars have looked at the particular legal records surrounding the theatre before, but they've looked within them only for mentions which are directly relevant to Shakespeare himself.
Of course, yeah.
And I can come on in a minute how Shakespeare feeds into this story. But actually what that means is an enormous amount of the other stuff, which I was fascinated by, has been disregarded. And the kind of the crucial thing that I became interested in was the sort of lives and the characters and personalities of these other people who Shakespeare worked alongside, who he knew extremely well. And the other thing that's worth saying about legal records that's fun is that the format of them is worth explaining, which is that a court would be begun in one of the big courts in Chancery, say, and then a witness would be summoned to depose to a clerk of the court, and they would speak out their responses to set questions, and those would be then transcribed by the clerks themselves. And what's fun for me, and what became a kind of a game I amused myself with, was when you get several different testimonies or depositions about the same event. Because then what you get is a fair degree of reliability if several different people describe the same thing as happening, you can assume that really did happen.
Right.
But you also get perspective, right? And then we're getting into the wonder of drama, because you get several different people's perspective on the same event. And the point I make in the book, and the point I'd like to sort of emphasize, is that what we celebrate of the Elizabethan age is its wonderful literature. It was a highly literary age. It was also an extremely litigious age. And that's really useful, right? Because then we have these extraordinary accounts of people squabbling and fighting and suing one another. And in doing that, revealing themselves, which to me is what the great, literary works do, is that they reveal characters across great stretches of time.
Yeah, and perhaps we should pick up on that point about Shakespeare, because the subtitle of your book is London's First Playhouse and the Making of William Shakespeare. So very much not just about the construction of the theatre and its life, but Shakespeare's involvement in it too.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I should say my subtitle comes with a kind of built-in apology, I suppose. And again, it's something that we could talk about, which is to what extent was the theatre really the first? I'm making this claim it was the first playhouse. Is that a claim we want to query a little bit? I think it's something that we certainly could query and talk about. But the interesting part of the story for me, and I hope for us now, is that yes, the theatre was either the first or a very early playhouse in London, but it was the place where the young Shakespeare worked when he first arrived in London. I know you've done other episodes on Shakespeare's kind of arrival in London and when exactly that took place, but it's certainly true that he did work very closely with this particular family, who I'd love to talk about, called the Burbages, who built and ran the playhouse itself. So these were men that Shakespeare knew incredibly well, and Shakespeare, learned a great deal from. Much of my vision of Shakespeare in the book is, I suppose, a response to or a revision of a kind of romantic idea of Shakespeare as this sort of solitary genius who stands apart from the messy concerns of the day-to-day world. What I wanted to do was put Shakespeare back in this kind of turbulent, quarrelsome, kind of argumentative world, which was absolutely exemplified by this family, the Burbages, who were a kind of a difficult bunch of people, I would say. But because they're difficult, they left traces, and therefore we can recover them.
I mean, although a lot of the story you tell is concerned with the collaboration of tradesmen needed to build the theatre, men of the apprentice and the guild system, it's also full of strong individual characters, and probably first and foremost amongst them is James Burbage, who seems to be someone that you either loved or hated, I guess, in real life. But I think it's true to say that without his energy and determination, the theatre would never have got built or have survived for as long as it did.
I think that's absolutely true. There's that line, I'm going to misquote it, but I'm sure your readers or your listeners will be able to correct me, that Hegel says something like Napoleon was history on horseback, right? There's a moment, we find these moments in history when single figures kind of embody all the energies of the age and of their time. And I'm very aware that kind of great men history has fallen out of fashion, the idea that we might tell history around the stories of single great men. Yeah. Having said that, I do think James Burbage was an unusually kind of energetic, vibrant, dynamic, kind of visionary figure. And it's worth saying that what James Burbage does is, in his early life, in his very early life, he trains as a joiner. And then he becomes a kind of traveling player. He's one of the Earl of Leicester's men. And he then decides to build a playhouse in London, in Shoreditch, which he names the theatre. Now, that same idea is occurring to other people at the same time, right? The idea that one might have a purpose-built, permanent commercial playhouse isn't exactly an idea that he invents. But for various reasons, he does it, I think, partly to do with chance and luck. He is more successful at it. And what crucially James Burbage has, and it's the quality that his two sons, who the more I thought about this, the more they seem to me the key kind of players in the story. The key quality that the Burbages share is a kind of tenacity, a kind of stubbornness to keep this place open and running, despite the great headwind is too light a way to put it, despite the great challenges of keeping vaguely profitable, keeping the kind of authorities off your back, keeping the playhouse open. Because at the core of all of this is a really simple business model. You can't just build a playhouse. You need to keep it open. You need to keep plays on the stage. You need to keep audiences coming in and paying for admission. That's what has to keep on happening. And almost everything in late Elizabethan London is running against that, right? Is working against you. So there are endless challenges, but nonetheless, James Burbage manages to keep this place open. I mentioned his sons. I'd love to sort of get into detail with those, but there's a kind of neatness to this story also. See, this is a family story, which is also maybe a Shakespearean way of seeing this. You know, Romeo and Juliet is a family play. It's a play about families. He has two sons, and the more famous one is the younger one, Richard Burbage, great actor.
Of course, yes.
But the older brother is the one who I became kind of convinced was the powerful figure here. And in the book, I call him sort of the money man. He runs the business side of things. But what's elegant for my purposes, to my mind, you know, I teach literature. I love a neat analogy whenever I can find one. Is that we have this figure, James Burbage, this kind of powerful impresario, and he is both a player, an actor, and he's also a businessman. And then he divides those qualities neatly between his two sons. So we have the younger son who is the actor, and then we have the older son who's the businessman. Right. And it's something crucial within that dynamic that keeps the theatre running. Now, what I should say is also, I think that dynamic is combustible, right? It can only run for so long, but for an extraordinarily successful period of time, it does manage to remain open. And there's a kind of extraordinary energy to that. I mean, you know, Oasis have just reunited and have gone on tour. I don't know if you're an Oasis fan, but something clearly at the core of the power of Oasis as a band, as a group, is that kind of combustible relationship between those brothers that gives them energy, absolutely. But it also means that they're never going to be on tour forever, right? They're never going to be the Rolling Stones.
Yes, absolutely. And I think James was clearly a risk taker. I mean, just stepping out from his training with a guild as a joiner to become a player, that was a risk.
He ran away and joined the circus. I mean, that's also part of the core of this story, right? No, there's absolutely no certainty to this. What there is, though, and I think this is crucial, it sounds romantic to say so. Having said earlier, I wanted to revise a kind of romantic story. I think we've got to acknowledge there's a kind of romantic dream at the heart of this. There is the possibility of doing something extraordinary, which is making money from creating art. And that is there are two parts to that dream, right? There's the creating art and there's the making money from it. That dream is the thing that James Burbage, I think, has very, very, very powerfully. So there's a risk, but there's also a substantial reward. And if everything had gone right, always, I mean, it didn't. Spoiler alert to my story, it all goes wrong at every possible moment, right? But if everything had gone right constantly, they would have made an enormous amount of money. And so that possibility is always animating everything that goes on in this story.
And the ways it went wrong, you would say, were circumstance rather than failing on James's part, or a bit of both? It's
a really good question. I think combination of the two. I think there was an amazing moment when I was trying to sort of figure out the real timeline in this, and it suddenly occurred to me that perhaps the one factor that that Burbage and his business partner hadn't quite reckoned with in enough detail was they wanted to build an outdoor playhouse, right? And that sounds great, but they hadn't quite thought through how the weather might relate to that. It seems to me it would be anyone else's starting point, right? We're building an outdoor playhouse. Let's think about the weather. So things tend to go wrong in the depths of winter when it's really cold, and things also go wrong in the summer because of the plague, which I do want to talk about in a minute, right? Summer is plague season. Plague season is a disaster for the playhouses because they all close down. So there's an absence of really good planning here. I think there's a great deal of improvisation, and I think it maybe helps to see this story as what happens when businessmen and kind of theatrical people are working closely together, and the ways in which business and also kind of play acting and performance might rely on the same sorts of strategies to get round certain sorts of problems. So one of those is improvisation. Another one of those is, there's a great word that someone uses to describe Burbage, which is stouting. And stouting means kind of willful defiance, really, right? Someone says you can't do something and you do it anyway. And that quality, I think I talked before about his tenacity. I think that capacity is great in an actor, and it's also, turns out, it's really useful in a businessman.
Yes, there's quite a famous story about him standing up to the Privy Council at one point where they're about to close him down, and he does that on the basis of his sponsor. But actually, that's just him chancing his arm.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as we know, it seems to be, and that's the kind of irony of this, which is that irony is putting it the wrong way, I suppose. We tell stories now about the Elizabethan world and the Elizabethan state as a kind of golden age. And very often we tell quite reassuring stories about this as a time of happy, expansive growth. And I think that is on one level true, but there's another way in which this is a period of kind of endless uncertainty, I suppose, and potential setbacks. And there's a kind of uncertainty about exactly what the rules are surrounding any of the things that we might take for granted now. And it matters that the theatre is built in London, but just outside the city wall. So it's in the suburbs, which means it's in a slightly less well-regulated space. Now, what that means is not simply that they have great freedom, because there is not great freedom in the police state of late Elizabethan England. But what there is a kind of useful ambiguity that can be exploited by certain people at certain moments. And I think James Burbage is someone who, when he saw ambiguity, he saw opportunity, I suppose. And so that's what we see about this kind of possibility of this sort of defiance of standing up to any authority figure who said, you must close down the Playhouse. You can't perform on Sundays, would seem to me the most obvious rule. It's quite clear. Either you are staging plays on Sundays or you aren't. And there are endless rules which say you cannot perform plays on Sundays. The theatre is clearly open on Sundays, right? And so it seems extraordinary to us now because that kind of contradicts everything we have about the idea of a kind of a well-policed state.
So that's the father, but as you say, some of those talents get carried into the sons as well. Cuthbert, definitely the businessman, and well trained in a clerical way and a legal way to deal with the issues that they get left with after James dies. But there's also, of course, Richard, and you tell a wonderful story about how he stands up to people as well within the Playhouse, him and his broomstick.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lovely story, and this is a story that one of the stories that's kind of plucked out about this as a moment. So what very often happens in the kind of story of the theatre, in the history of the theatre, is that because the Burbages are perpetually in debt, various people who they owe money to turn up and try to get that money back by one means or another. And it never seems to really work. And the particular moment that's a great story that there are several accounts of this is of a woman who's the widow of James Burbage's business partner. So she actually has a pretty good claim to owning a share or even perhaps half of the theatre itself. She turns up and with a few followers and tries to actually take her share of the ticket proceeds. And the Burbage family, all of them kind of realize what's happening, and they all, in outrage and fury, rush over to see these people who are trying to take money from them. And it's a fascinating moment because the kind of Burbage family reaction, and particularly in the father James, is a kind of outraged fury. And that's understandable. Someone is disrupting his place of business that he's worked incredibly hard to establish. But the Richard, his son, the actor, his response is very different, and is this kind of strange, sort of performative, ironic response, which is he turns up with a broomstick and sort of torments or teases or lightly tortures the people who are attempting to take the proceeds. I love the fact it's a broomstick he's using, partly because as a prop, it's so great. I mean, is it a weapon or not? Right? It partly is a weapon. You could do quite a lot of damage with a broomstick.
Absolutely.
But it's also a joke, right? And it's what do you do with a broomstick? You sweep out the trash. Yeah. So there's a kind of lovely doubleness to that as a thing. I love that it's a broomstick, in part because a broomstick appears in Midsummer Night's Dream, but also I love that it's a broomstick because it's probably both a prop and something that was also just, somewhere backstage, to clean up at the end of a show, you're going to need a broomstick.
Yeah, it's there, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So there are a lot of things, and this tells us something interesting about theatre more broadly, that there isn't maybe a sharp distinction between the things which are props and the things which are normal elements from daily life. The difference is what you do with them. So you put an object, which is the most pedestrian of objects, like a broomstick, something we would use every day, into the hands of a great actor, and suddenly that object itself transforms. It takes on all sorts of other meanings. So even as we have this kind of curious moment of the young Richard Burbage trying to kind of sweep out or threaten or get rid of these people who are trying to take money from him, we also have a drama in miniature, right? We have a little play taking place. It's not on stage, it's in the yard, but it nonetheless is a great moment of kind of theatrical activity.
Yeah, you can just imagine that. It really comes to life. you significantly draw together the relationship between Shakespeare and Richard. And I think you suggest that one could not have been successful without the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is right. And what I should say is that Richard Burbage is known because, all Shakespeare scholars kind of repeat this same fact, which is a striking one, which is that Shakespeare writes the lead role in really all of his most celebrated plays for the same actor. And it really helps us suddenly, I think, to see the way in which Shakespeare is therefore benefiting from and drawing from his relationships with this group of people. So Richard Burbage is the first actor to perform Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, and so on. He's the first Romeo. So that is known to us, and I think that's a useful thing to remember. But what it also reminds me of, or makes me think, is how deeply. Well, actually, there are two things actually it makes me think. First is how deeply Shakespeare is working with a particular group of people in a particular space. Again, I said before, I want to get away from the idea of Shakespeare as the kind of solitary romantic genius. I think that's an important one. He's someone who's working in company with this set of people. And the other thing that it makes me think is maybe there are all sorts of other things too that we're missing now, right? So we know about Richard Burbage because Richard Burbage became kind of like, he was like the first movie star. He became incredibly celebrated and famous, and he was certainly more famous than Shakespeare in their own lifetimes. And that means that we have a certain amount of kind of documentation about Richard, but Shakespeare's also writing for other members of the company. And Shakespeare remains, this is extremely unusual, Shakespeare remains working with this same group of men pretty much throughout his whole career.
Yeah.
Now, the name of the company changes who he's working with. So gives us some element of confusion, right? The Chamberlain's men become the King's men.
Sure.
But it's the same core of people who he's working with again and again. And that has all sorts of huge implications. So on one level, perhaps the most simple level, we have Shakespeare collaborating with this actor, because he knows that Richard Burbage can do certain things. In order to play a role like Richard III, you have to have an actor who is capable of extraordinary things. Equally, in order to play King Lear, you have to, assume or build upon a kind of faith that your actor is going to be able to do it. And so that's crucial. But again, it also works the other way, right? And I think that there's not just a vision where Shakespeare's writing the roles and he hands them over to Richard and Richard performs them. That was working one way. I think there's a kind of dynamic relationship here that works back and forth. And my suspicion is there are all sorts of in-jokes that will never be known to us now,
right,
about that relationship built in. And also equally that Shakespeare would very likely have had those kinds of relationships with other actors in the company too. So again, a very collaborative process. These are company men working together within a company rather than sort of single figures who are known to us now and who are celebrated by us now.
Mm. You draw significant parallels between the early career of Shakespeare and the stages of the Guild apprenticeship. And I think one of the things that really comes out in the book is how embedded that system, that Guild system and the apprenticeship system was in everyday life in Elizabethan England. Can you just take us through your thinking of how you see Shakespeare's development reflected in the Guild system and particularly in apprenticeship leading to other stages of employment?
Yeah, absolutely. This is crucial to the kind of story I'm trying to tell, and I suppose to the vision I'm trying to suggest of how these extraordinary works of art emerge in this moment. Now, it's very tempting to see these two systems as antagonistic, right? On the one hand, we have work, the world of work, right? We have apprentices, young men. It doesn't have to be young men, but it almost always is. Young men moving to London, training. They bind themselves to a master for 7 years on average, training up in a trade. It could be any trade. And those trades are organized by the companies, the livery companies. So that extremely kind of regulated, heavy system is intensely important in Elizabethan England. And it's a system which regulates work. It also regulates kind of participation in political life, because it's only by going through the system of an apprenticeship and becoming a member of a company that one gains the right to, for example, vote in the Lord Mayoral election. So it's not a fully enfranchised society. That's the way you become a kind of political member of an actively political member of society. So that's a tremendously important system. For interesting reasons, that dies out towards the end of the 17th century. We still have the livery companies today. They're very different kinds of organizations today. But there are these intensely important organizations. And this is an incredibly common thing to happen as well. This is really important too. Steve Rappaport is the historian who's done the most work on this. It's kind of fascinating series of studies. Two-thirds of the men in London had done apprenticeships. This is the dominant system. They knew this very, very well. Now, Shakespeare doesn't do that. He doesn't do an apprenticeship, in part because he marries young, and you can't be married as an apprentice. So on the one hand, we have work, the world of work, heavy, serious, and regulated. Now, it's an easy pun, right? But what's the opposite of that? It's the world of play, right? It's plays, it's fun, it's being an actor, it's not having work. So what scholars tend to have done, to my mind, is separate those two worlds, is to see the world of fun, play, literature, poetry, glamour, and so on one side, and then think there's this kind of lesser world, which is the world of work on the other side. To confuse the story a little bit, those worlds were supposed to be kept separate. Apprentices were not supposed to go and see plays, but they did. They were the people who stuffed the audiences at the playhouses. What I want to suggest in the book, what I want to argue in the book, is that while Shakespeare doesn't do a technical apprenticeship because he can't, because he's married, what he does is a kind of ghost version of an apprenticeship. And that's because this model, this structure, is in everyone's mind. This is what they know as a structure. And so when he moves to London, what he does is he kind of binds himself in a sort of proxy apprenticeship and collaborates with older or more successful playwrights. So he's a collaborative writer, first of all. He's working with the kind of masters of that trade, and he rises up. And Shakespeare unusually is collaborative in the early years of his career, and then in the middle of his career, he's not collaborative. And that's unusual even for other playwrights. So he's doing something different. What I think he's doing is very simple, which is he's learning. He's learning how to write great plays, and he's learning how to write great plays from the playwrights who are already writing great plays. Many of them you've had episodes about, Robert Greene, or he's working with Peele, or he's working with Marlowe. He's working with those sorts of people. What that means as a vision is, I think, a crucial one, because it focuses Shakespeare and Shakespeare's interests and Shakespeare's imagination, which is this magical thing. It's very difficult to talk about Shakespeare's imagination because he clearly was a literary genius. It focuses that back into a much more regulated set of patterns. And I can't emphasize this strongly enough. I think Shakespeare became Shakespeare because he was extraordinary, but I also think he became Shakespeare because he was an incredibly hard worker and worked in a very, very careful and regulated and often very pragmatic way. And that meant that what he did is he moved through something that looked like took about the same amount of time as an apprenticeship before becoming a kind of master of his trade, before becoming a member of the company, which he did. That's how Shakespeare made money. He didn't make money from writing plays. He made money from being a member of the company. And he only got to that position by working through this kind of model. And I said before, it's tempting to see the world of work and the world of play as different. And I'm as guilty of this as everyone else, right? Anyone who is a kind of literary scholar or who teaches Shakespeare or who writes about Shakespeare wants to celebrate just Shakespeare. We want to celebrate him for poetry. We want to celebrate him for creativity. We perhaps want to forget about the world of economics and business and money and profit and so on. And what I want to say is that we have to put that world back in there before we can really understand anything that's going on in these plays or the way these plays were produced, is we have to put these much more kind of worldly ambitions and interests back at the heart of the story.
Yes, I have been learning that big time since I started this project.
I'm sure.
So writing is a craft, not an art, you would say. And as for the young playwright, would he have struggled to actually earn a living at being a playwright?
Yes, is the simple answer. He certainly would have struggled to make a living. What's a decent living in Elizabethan England? A school teacher makes £25 a year. So let's take that as our standard for a decent living. If you're a playwright, when you write a play, you sell it. You don't get any royalties from it. You sell it to a playing company, and you probably get £7 if you're lucky. So you need to write 4 plays a year to earn the same as a school teacher. Writing 4 plays a year is a huge amount of work, particularly if you are, as Shakespeare was doing, also doing other sorts of jobs, right? He's also working probably as an actor in small parts. He maybe is helping with all sorts of other things in the playhouse too. And then, of course, there's an outbreak of plague, and then the playhouse is closed down, and then therefore you don't get your play staged, and there's no need for play, so you don't get your £7. So yeah, it's an absolute struggle to earn a living. Your question was, is playwriting therefore a craft, not an art? I suppose I want to say it can be both. And that's the lovely thing. It can combine both of those things. And it doesn't need to be seen just as one at the expense of the other. But my sense of Shakespeare is, yes, the quality that enabled him both to produce plays and to keep producing them. That's the crucial thing. Shakespeare has a very long career compared to his contemporaries. He writes a lot of plays compared to his contemporaries. The reason he's able to do that is, I would argue, precisely because of his agreement with your question, right? Which is that playwriting is a craft, not an art. It's something that needs to be pursued as a job, as a daily job, as something that needs to be pursued with that kind of training and that kind of serious mindedness and that kind of diligence. So any idea of somebody possibly managing to write a play simply because they happen to be inspired that morning by the muse or whatever the inspiration is, it's a lovely idea for a movie like Shakespeare in Love. But I don't think it's a helpful idea in explaining Shakespeare.
This goes well beyond the end of your book, but does that give you some insight into why he stopped when he did?
That's a great question. Why does he stop when he did? No one will ever really know. He's certainly young by modern standards, but he is old by the standards of his day. Perhaps he's tired. Perhaps there is a sense in which there's not much more to do. I mentioned already Shakespeare Collaborative as a young man and then working as a solo author for the kind of middle of his career. What's striking and moving is that at the end of his career, he then returns to writing collaboratively. And people speculate as to why that might be. He doesn't need to by this point. He's trained up. He is celebrated. He's clearly capable of writing plays. He's very good at writing plays by this point. And is that because the world is changing around him? Fashions are changing. Is he starting to look old? I mean, there's a way in which even Shakespeare, even this kind of shorthand for extraordinary creativity and originality, might by this point not be the thing that the market's looking for. And it's clear from people who've studied, the kinds of plays that are fashionable in this period, that what really sells is novelty. It's true today also the things which are fashionable. And perhaps therefore Shakespeare's kind of styles and techniques are beginning to look slightly out of date.
And we have to finish, I'm afraid, with talking about the plague, because the plague and its aftermath has such a significant effect on the theatre with capital letters and without, the players and the playwrights. And it includes what you, I think, quite rightly call a fire sale of scripts, which is something that I hadn't thought about before, and why we suddenly get these scripts coming out of the ownership of their original playing companies. But times were really tough for being a playwright and a player.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we know that there were perennial outbreaks of plague. We've always known that in 16th century England. And there are certain what's called plague years. 1594 was a very big one. 1603 was a very big one. And that's known to biographers of Shakespeare. What I think has been undervalued to those who've thought about Shakespeare is the extent to which plague wasn't just this kind of occasional crisis that then went away. It was a perpetual condition. And almost every summer, the playhouses are closed down because there's maybe a minor outbreak of plague, or there's a fear of an outbreak of plague, or because the Lord Mayor hates the playhouses and wants to shut down the playhouses, and plague is a useful excuse. So it's this constant limiting factor, which means that the business model is at peril at all times. You've opened your playhouse, you need people coming in, you need an audience buying tickets. You get closed down when there's an outbreak of plague or the fear of plague. And so that, I think, it takes us back to our kind of thinking about business. What people have sometimes remarked is that, isn't it strange that Shakespeare's plays so rarely actually mention plague? Plague doesn't appear to turn up in the plays themselves. And how can you explain that if, as you're saying, this was one of the crucial conditions that surrounded the creation of plays in the period? Well, I mean, I'd say quite simply, the last thing you want to write about if you're a playwright is plague, right? Because it's your enemy. And also it's not very funny to an audience of people to make jokes about plague if, they've just buried their children or their sisters or their brothers because of a recent outbreak of plague. So it's not a tremendously kind of funny or interesting topic. I wrote some sections of this book and certainly thought a great deal about it during our own pandemic. And what that taught me, and I think it taught this to all of us, which is that a pandemic has lots of very dramatic immediate effects, but it has all sorts of surprising other sorts of effects too. And so I think we might think about ways in which that sort of constant condition is one which surrounds Shakespeare. When there are plague years, when there are periods of the playhouses being closed, Shakespeare, who is extremely pragmatic, writes poems. And he pursues a model which turns out not to work for him, which is whereby a patron would pay him to write poetry. Now, as a business model, that does work for other people. It doesn't turn out to work for Shakespeare. He is truly a man of the theatre. Not those poems aren't wonderful. I'm not talking about the sonnets. The sonnets are a separate question. I'm talking about mainly about Venus and Adonis. But those poems are kind of extraordinary, and they give us an image of a kind of pragmatic Shakespeare, again, responding to those sorts of conditions. Plague, I think, is fascinating as a backdrop, and it's almost fascinating as a kind of a tiny occurrence that's glimpsed at. And the play in which, to my mind, most powerfully that happens is Romeo and Juliet, when there is a very minor occurrence of the plague, and it's the factor which prevents the crucial message getting to Romeo in time. And that message is, of course, spoiler alert, that Juliet's not really dead. She's only pretending to be dead. And the fact that message can't get through, they're in lockdown, is the reason why it can't get through, is because of an outbreak of the plague in that moment. So there are these moments when Shakespeare is kind of reflecting upon this constant sort of threat that surrounds him. And again, I've said this already, but I hope it bears repeating, is that my vision of the world that produced Shakespeare is this world which is constantly kind of on the edge of crisis. It's a world which is changing very rapidly. It's a world in which there are fears about changes of climate, for example. And it's also a world in which uncertainty is the kind of daily condition of everyone's life. And the astonishing thing, to my mind, the kind of the magical thing, is that out of this world of extraordinary, extreme uncertainty, Shakespeare manages to create, or Shakespeare's company manages to create, the most permanent works of art that we have, almost the most permanent things that we have as the human race. So I find that a little bit comforting. When faced with a plague, there might be the possibility of the creation of kind of extraordinary art, despite everything running against that.
My thanks to Daniel for taking the time to talk to us. The Dream Factory is published by Yale University Press and is available from wherever you get your books, and I've put links to the online stores and the publisher in the show notes. Next time, it's another guest episode where we will be travelling back to ancient Greek theatre and the aftermath of the Trojan War, while still keeping it incredibly current. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with the new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to accompanying next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can always contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.